The music had barely faded when my father stood champagne glass lifted his smile too sharp for the moment. Everyone hushed, expecting a blessing, a toast, something warm to mark my new life. Instead, his voice cut through the air like a blade. "She's not my real daughter." For a second, I thought I had misheard. The clinking of cutlery stopped. My mother's face drained of color. My groom's hand tightened around mine under the table, but I couldn't feel it, only the roar in my ears, the silence stretching after those words. Guests shifted uncomfortably, whispers like a rising tide. My father didn't sit down. He just smirked as though he had been waiting years to say it aloud. I wanted to scream, to demand what he meant, but my throat closed. Every eye was on me, every camera lens pointed my way. My wedding dress suddenly felt like a costume, my life like a stranger's. My father's words weren't a slip. They were deliberate, calculated. And I knew in that instant that something inside me had shattered forever. I had always thought of myself as an ordinary woman living an ordinary life. I grew up in a suburban neighborhood in a modest two-story house with white shutters and a garden my mother tended religiously. My childhood from the outside looked picture perfect. Birthday parties in the backyard, school plays with my parents sitting front row, family vacations, where we posed for smiling photos on sandy beaches. But beneath those photos, there had always been cracks I chose to ignore. My father, Raymond, was a stern man. He was not cruel in the ways people could see, but his coldness carried weight. He rarely hugged me, rarely praised me, rarely said I love you. When he did speak of me, it was often as if I were a project he had invested in, rather than a daughter he adored. My mother, Claire, was the opposite, warm, patient, and endlessly protective. She smoothed over his sharp edges, excused his silences, and filled my life with affection so I would not notice the absence of his. For years, I convinced myself this was just who he was, emotionally distant, a man trapped in his own walls. I told myself that not all fathers were affectionate, and that I should simply be grateful he provided, that he never raised a hand against me. But deep down, there had always been a voice that asked why he looked at me differently than he looked at my younger brother Thomas. Thomas was the golden child. He inherited my father's height, his square jaw, his love for business and numbers. He was everything my father wanted in a son: ambitious, confident, quick to pick up the habits of success. I was different. I loved literature, painting, and the quiet hours when I could lose myself in stories. While Thomas and Dad bonded over stock charts, I would sit at the edge of the table unnoticed with my sketchbook. The gap between us widened as I grew older. When Thomas won his first debate competition, Dad took him out for a celebratory dinner. When I had my first art exhibition at a local gallery, Dad didn't even attend. My mother went alone, clutching her purse tightly, as if her presence could make up for his absence, and maybe it did because I smiled through it, pretending not to notice the empty space in the audience. Yet despite this undercurrent of difference, I had never imagined that the reason for his distance was because I wasn't his daughter at all. That night after the wedding, long after the champagne glasses were cleared and the music had died, I replayed his words over and over. I couldn't sleep. My new husband Daniel held me close, but even his warmth felt foreign, like I was a stranger to myself. "She's not my real daughter." The phrase was like a curse I couldn't shake. Growing up, there had been little signs. I didn't share my father's sharp cheekbones or Thomas's hazel eyes. My hair was darker than both of theirs, my frame more delicate compared to their athletic builds. People sometimes commented, "You look just like your mother," but never once did anyone say I resembled him. I brushed it off as genetics favoring one parent. But now, in the raw light of his public revelation, every difference screamed for attention. I thought back to the nights when I overheard my parents arguing behind closed doors. Their voices muffled my mother's pleading, my father's low growl. I had never understood the words, but the tension had seeped under the door, filling the house like smoke. Could they have been fighting about me? I remembered how as a child my father sometimes called me Claire's girl as if I didn't belong to him. At the time I thought it was affectionate. Now it echoed with a different meaning, one that made my stomach churn. Daniel urged me to confront him, to demand the truth immediately, but I couldn't. Not yet. The humiliation of his words in front of all our friends and family still burned too raw. I needed to gather myself to breathe before tearing open the wound he had inflicted. Instead, I called my mother. It was past midnight, but she answered on the second ring, her voice trembling. "Sweetheart, I was afraid you'd call." "Is it true?" My voice cracked. "What he said. Is it true?" Silence stretched on the line, and in that silence I found my answer. Finally, she whispered, "Yes." The floor seemed to give way beneath me. I sank into the bed, clutching the phone as though it were the only thing anchoring me to the earth. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I wanted to," she said, tears lacing her words. "I wanted to every single day. But your father, he insisted. He said it was better for you not to know. He didn't want the shame, the whispers. I thought I was protecting you, but maybe I was only protecting myself." Her confession sliced deeper than I could bear. My whole life had been a carefully constructed lie. My mother knew. My father knew. Everyone who should have given me unconditional love had decided instead to build my life on secrets. In the days after the wedding, I wore a mask for the world. To Daniel's family, I smiled. To my friends, I sent thank you notes for their gifts. But inside, I was unraveling. My father avoided me, retreating behind his newspaper and his office, while Thomas acted as though nothing had happened at all. My mother, on the other hand, called me every day, her guilt dripping through the phone line, begging me to meet so she could explain. When we finally sat down, she told me the truth, or at least part of it. She had fallen in love once before she married my father. A man named Michael. A man who she admitted had been the love of her life. "You're his daughter," she said, her eyes red, her hands trembling. "You're not Raymond's by blood, but you are mine. You have always been mine." I should have felt relief at having an answer. Instead, I felt betrayal upon betrayal. My mother had loved someone else. My father had known and punished me silently for years, and I had lived 30 years in the dark believing I was someone I was not. What cut the deepest was the realization that my father had chosen my wedding day, the most sacred, vulnerable moment of my life, to unmask the truth. It wasn't just a careless comment. It was a deliberate act of cruelty. He wanted me humiliated. He wanted me reduced. He wanted me small. But as the days stretched into weeks, another feeling began to replace the hurt anger. Slow at first, then sharp, then burning. If my father had thought he could break me with those words, he was mistaken. He had given me the truth, yes, but he had also given me a weapon. Because if he wanted secrets aired in public, he had no idea just how many were still buried. And I was ready to dig them up. The day I finally confronted my father, the sky hung low and heavy, as though the universe itself was bracing for the storm. I drove back to my childhood home, each turn of the wheel pulling me deeper into memories I wasn't sure I wanted anymore. The white shutters, the garden my mother once fussed over, the familiar crack in the driveway. All of it looked the same, but I no longer belonged there. He was in his office, as always, the scent of cigar smoke lingering even though he wasn't supposed to smoke indoors. My father looked up when I walked in, his expression a mixture of annoyance and expectation, as though he knew why I had come and was impatient to get it over with. "You didn't have to do it like that," I said, my voice shaking. He leaned back in his leather chair, folding his hands over his stomach. "Better you know than continue living in a lie." "You humiliated me on my wedding day," I snapped. In front of everyone, I know you decided to announce that I wasn't your daughter. Was that your idea of a gift? His lips curled into a smirk. You should be grateful. Now you know who you really are. Grateful. The word cut like glass. He had always spoken to me as though I owed him something, my existence, my success, my gratitude for being tolerated in his home. Now I realized why. To him, I had never truly been his. I had been an obligation, a reminder of my mother's betrayal. I want to know everything, I said firmly. Who my father is, what happened, and why you chose to make a spectacle of me. For the first time, his smirk faltered. He looked away, reaching for the cigar box on his desk, his fingers restless. Your mother already told you enough, he muttered. Not from her, I said, from you. He lit the cigar slowly, deliberately, letting the smoke fill the room. When he finally spoke, his words were laced with bitterness. Your mother was never faithful. She loved another man before me, and she couldn't let him go. She swore it ended before we married, but then you came along. You think I didn't notice you looked nothing like me? Nothing like Thomas. I knew from the moment you opened your eyes that you weren't mine. But I raised you anyway. I gave you a home, and this is how you repay me standing here demanding answers. You raised me, I scoffed. You ignored me, dismissed me, treated me like I was less than your son. Don't pretend you ever saw me as family. His jaw tightened. You got food on the table, clothes on your back, and an education, didn't you? That's more than your real father would have given you. There it was, the venom. He hated me not for what I had done, but for existing, for being proof of my mother's indiscretion. I wanted to scream, to throw the cigar box across the room, but instead I stood tall. You didn't expose me to set me free, I said. You did it to punish me, to punish her. His silence confirmed it. I left before the tears could fall. Outside, the cold air hit me like a slap, but it cleared my head. My father had given me fragments of the truth, but I still didn't know the man whose blood ran through my veins. Michael. My mother had spoken his name with trembling lips, her eyes filled with a longing that told me he wasn't just a mistake, he had been love. That night I searched through old boxes in my mother's attic, the ones labeled with faded ink letters, photos, 1980s. My hands shook as I sifted through them until I found a small bundle of envelopes tied with a ribbon. They were addressed to my mother, the handwriting elegant, the ink slightly smudged. The return address was from a town 2 hours away. I opened the first letter, Claire. Every moment without you feels like a wound that refuses to heal. I don't care what they say. I don't care about the rules, we belong together. If Raymond truly loves you, he'll let you go. But if he won't, I'll wait for you. I'll always wait. Signed simply, Michael. My heart pounded as I read through more. Each letter painted a picture of a man deeply in love, desperate, unwilling to let her go. And yet she had married Raymond. She had stayed. Was it out of duty? Fear? Or had she chosen stability over passion, choosing a man who could provide rather than the one who made her heart race? Whatever the reason, I was the living reminder of that choice. The next weekend, I drove to the address on the envelopes, unsure if it still existed. To my shock, the house was still there, a modest brick home with ivy crawling up the side. My stomach twisted as I knocked on the door. A man in his 60s answered. His hair was silver, but his eyes mirrored my own. Dark, searching, with a flicker of recognition that froze us both in place. Can I help you? He asked cautiously. I swallowed hard. My name is Emily. My mother is Claire. His face drained of color. He stepped aside, motioning me in. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old books and coffee. He led me to the living room where family photos lined the walls. A wife, children, grandchildren. He had built a whole life. Yet as we sat down, his gaze never left me. You're hers, he said softly. You're mine. I couldn't speak. My throat closed with the weight of it. He leaned forward, his hands trembling. I always wondered what became of you. She never let me see you. She told me it was for the best that you needed stability. But I wrote. I begged. Raymond hated me. He threatened me more than once. So I stayed away. But I never stopped thinking about you. His words hit me harder than I expected. Here was a man who claimed he had wanted me, fought for me, yet lived a whole life without me. Could I blame him for protecting himself? Or did I resent him for not fighting harder? When I left his house, I wasn't sure what I felt. Relief that I knew him, anger that it had taken 30 years, or grief for all the moments we had lost. That night, lying awake next to Daniel, I realized the truth wasn't just about biology, it was about betrayal. My mother had betrayed my father. My father had betrayed me with his cruelty, and Michael had betrayed us all by giving up. And as I pieced it together, one thought burned clear. If my father wanted to drag secrets into the light, then he would learn what it felt like. Because the secrets buried in our family weren't only about me, they were about him too. And I was going to find them. The days that followed were marked by a strange quietness, as though the storm had passed, but left me standing in its wreckage. Everyone went back to their lives, Thomas to his career, my mother to her garden, and my father to his office, pretending nothing had changed. But for me, nothing was the same. I had spent 30 years of my life in the shadows of secrets, and now that I had glimpsed the truth, I couldn't unsee it. If my father thought his little outburst at my wedding was the final word, he was wrong. He had opened a door and I intended to step through it fully. It began with questions. Quiet ones at first, directed at my mother, who still called every day as though trying to glue the broken pieces of our relationship back together. What exactly did Raymond know? When did he find out? She answered carefully, but I caught the details she let slip. He had always suspected. He had read one of Michael's letters, and this one made me pause. He had threatened her. "What do you mean threatened?" I pressed. My mother's voice cracked. "He told me if I ever tried to see Michael again, he would ruin me. He would take Thomas from me. He would make sure I had nothing." The image of my father as the cold, calculating man I had always known suddenly sharpened into something darker. He wasn't just distant, he was manipulative. He had used fear to keep her silent bitterness to punish me and appearances to maintain his control. The more I thought about it, the more it enraged me. His cruelty wasn't limited to me. He had held my mother hostage in a marriage and in doing so stolen a piece of my identity. That night I made a decision. If my father wanted to expose secrets at the expense of my dignity, then I would expose his at the expense of his pride. But unlike him, I wouldn't do it recklessly. I would be deliberate, precise, calculated. So I began my plan. The first step was information. I started visiting my mother more often, not just to comfort her, but to search through the boxes of old files and letters she had tucked away. My mother, weary and guilty, didn't resist. It was almost as if she wanted me to see. Among the piles, I found fragments, old bank statements, correspondence from my father's business ventures, and most intriguingly, a thin folder of letters from a woman I didn't recognize. The handwriting was elegant, but the words were intimate. My heart pounded as I realized what I was holding: love letters. Not from my mother, these were addressed to my father. The hypocrisy stung. He had berated her for loving Michael while secretly harboring his own affair. The earliest letter was dated 10 years into their marriage, the most recent, less than 5 years ago. My fingers trembled as I read, "Raymond, I can't keep waiting forever. You promised me things would change. How long must I stay hidden while you play the devoted husband?" Her name was Margaret. I didn't know who she was, but I knew she was important. The second step was confirmation. I hired a discreet investigator, someone I found through a recommendation from a colleague of Daniel's. I told him what I suspected and handed him the folder of letters. Within weeks, he came back with more than I had bargained for: photographs, financial records, even property documents. My father hadn't just had an affair. He had been funneling money into a separate bank account for years, an account Margaret had access to. And the property documents revealed something more damning: he had bought her a house 2 towns over under her name. I felt the air leave my lungs as I stared at the evidence. My father, who had humiliated me in front of hundreds, who had despised my mother for one act of love, had built an entire second life on lies. Step 3 was leverage. I didn't want to destroy him in the shadows; that would be too easy. I wanted him to feel the same public sting he had inflicted on me. I wanted the world to see him for what he was. But first I needed allies. I showed the evidence to my mother. She wept, not out of shock because she had always suspected, but out of relief that the truth was finally visible. For years she had carried guilt for her love for Michael, believing she had been the only one who betrayed. Now she knew it wasn't just her. Raymond had played his own games all along. "Do you want me to expose him?" I asked her. She looked at me through her tears, her voice steady for the first time in weeks. "He took so much from me, from us. Maybe it's time the world saw who he really is." That was all the permission I needed. The fourth step was setting the stage. My father prided himself on reputation. He was a prominent figure in the community, on the board of a local bank, a member of the country club, a man others turned to for advice. He thrived on the illusion of integrity. So I decided to shatter it in the same way he had shattered me publicly. I arranged a family dinner under the pretense of reconciliation. I invited Thomas and his wife, my mother, and of course my father. I told him I wanted to heal and move forward. He agreed, smug in his victory, believing I was coming back to heal. But I had a different script in mind. On the night of the dinner, we gathered around the long oak table in my parents' dining room. My father sat at the head, as always, sipping his wine, with that familiar air of authority. Conversation was stilted, my mother quiet, Thomas oblivious. Finally, when the plates were cleared and the glasses refilled, I raised mine. "I'd like to make a toast," I said, my voice steady. My father smirked, no doubt remembering his own cruel toast at my wedding. "Go on then," he said. I looked directly at him, my eyes unwavering. "To family, to the truths we carry, and to the lies we bury until they're too heavy to hide." The room stilled. I placed a small envelope on the table and slid it toward him. His brow furrowed as he opened it. Inside were the photographs: him with Margaret, the house deed, the bank statements. His face went pale, his hand trembling for the first time I'd ever seen. "What is this?" Thomas asked, leaning forward. My father's lips pressed into a thin line, his silence betraying him more than words ever could. I leaned back, letting the weight of the moment sink in. "It seems I'm not the only one who doesn't belong, am I?" The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my mother's quiet, satisfied exhale. It wasn't just revenge. It was justice. He had humiliated me publicly. Now I had returned the favor in front of the people who mattered most to him. And yet, as I watched his face crumble, a strange calm settled over me. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Because if one secret could unravel so much, what else was still buried? And I intended to find out. After the dinner, everything shifted. My father no longer looked like the towering figure who had dominated my childhood. That night, for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Fear of exposure. Fear of losing control. And it gave me a kind of strength I hadn't felt before. But strength wasn't something that came overnight. It was a slow process, like learning to walk again after years of being told to crawl. At first, I struggled with guilt. My father avoided me completely after that evening, refusing calls, ignoring my presence at family gatherings. Thomas, furious at me for airing dirty laundry, called me dramatic and selfish. He didn't want to believe his perfect father was capable of betrayal. My mother, though relieved, was still fragile, torn between the years she had given him and the freedom she now saw before her. Daniel stood by me through it all, but even his support couldn't erase the loneliness I felt. I realized I had lived my whole life in orbit around this man, seeking his approval, fearing his disapproval, tailoring my every move to avoid his rejection. Now that I had pulled away, there was a terrifying emptiness, like stepping into open air after the ground has vanished beneath you. But in that emptiness was possibility. I started small. I returned to painting. For years, I had pushed aside my canvases, my brushes, my colors. I told myself I didn't have time, that family career marriage came first. But truthfully, it was my father's voice in my head dismissing it as a frivolous hobby. Now I let myself sit for hours painting without fear of judgment. The colors bled onto the canvas, vibrant, chaotic, free. It was as though I was reclaiming parts of myself I had buried along with the secrets. Then I went further. I had once dreamed of opening a gallery of my own, a space for artists like me, people who didn't fit into the rigid boxes expected of them. I had shelved that dream long ago, convincing myself it was impractical, but now I pulled it back out. With Daniel's encouragement, I contacted old connections from my art school days. To my surprise, they remembered me. Some even admired the few works I had shown years ago. One woman, a curator, offered to help me put together a showcase. It felt surreal standing in the empty space of a small gallery downtown, imagining my work on those white walls. For the first time in decades, I felt alive. Independence came in other ways, too. I began distancing myself from Thomas's constant criticisms, from his condescending remarks that echoed our father's. For years, I had let him diminish me, afraid of conflict. Now I simply walked away. If you don't like who I am, I told him once, that's your problem, not mine. The look on his face, shocked disbelief, was almost satisfying. But the real test was my mother. She had lived her entire life under my father's shadow, shrinking herself to survive. Now, with the truth laid bare, she seemed torn between liberation and fear. She confessed to me one evening, tears rolling down her cheeks. "I don't know who I am without him." Her words struck me. Because I knew exactly how she felt, I had lived that same fear. But I had chosen to step away to rebuild. I realized then that my own journey wasn't just about reclaiming my life. It was about showing her she could reclaim hers too. "Come with me to the gallery," I told her. "See what I'm building. You don't have to be just his wife anymore. You can be you." She came. She stood beside me in that empty space, her hand trembling in mine. And for the first time, I saw a spark in her eyes, something fragile but real. The stronger I grew, the more my father weakened. His image in the community began to crack. Word of his affair in his secret house slipped out, not from me directly, but from whispers, from the evidence that had been left behind at the dinner. People at the bank began questioning his integrity. He stepped down from one of his board positions, citing health reasons, but I knew better. The man who had lived for reputation was slowly losing it. And strangely, I no longer needed revenge to feel whole. His downfall wasn't my only focus anymore. My independence, my art, my marriage, these things gave me power in ways he never could. I began to feel a sense of justice, not the kind delivered in one sharp blow, but the kind that builds quietly, steadily, until it cannot be ignored. My father's power was crumbling while mine was rising, not because I destroyed him, but because I finally chose to live fully, unapologetically. Months later, my gallery opened. The night was filled with light laughter and the hum of voices admiring my work. My paintings hung proudly on the walls, each one a piece of my story, grief, betrayal, rage, and finally, resilience. Daniel held my hand as guests congratulated me, and my mother stood in the corner, her face glowing with pride. I caught sight of my father outside once, standing across the street watching. He didn't come in. He didn't speak. He only stood there, a shadow of the man he used to be. For a moment, our eyes met through the glass, and in his gaze, I saw something I had never seen before: defeat. I didn't smile, didn't wave. I simply turned back to my guests, my life, my future. Because I had finally understood independence isn't about proving yourself to those who refuse to see you. It's about proving to yourself that you were always enough. Yet just as I began to feel settled, a strange message arrived in my mailbox one morning. A plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 6 words scrawled in neat handwriting. "You don't know the whole truth!" My stomach twisted. Because as much as I wanted to believe my journey was complete, I knew then that the final twist was still waiting for me. The envelope haunted me for days. I left it on the kitchen counter at first, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just a cruel prank or a cowardly attempt by my father to regain control. But every time I passed it, the 6 words seemed to grow louder, heavier. "You don't know the whole truth." I had spent months uncovering the lies, exposing my father's hypocrisy, reclaiming my life. I thought I finally had the full picture. What else could there possibly be? But my gut told me this wasn't something I could ignore. I examined the envelope carefully. No handwriting I recognized, no postmark beyond the local sorting center. Whoever had sent it knew me, knew where I lived, and wanted me to doubt everything I thought I had learned. At first, I considered confronting my father again, but instinct told me he wasn't behind it. The handwriting was too careful, too deliberate, lacking his bluntness. And he had already lost enough. What motive would he have to stir things again? Instead, I went back to the attic boxes, the ones I had only half sorted in my frantic search for my real father. Tucked among the brittle papers and faded photos, I found something I hadn't noticed before: a locked tin box. It was small, no bigger than a shoebox, and wedged beneath layers of old linens. My hands shook as I pried it open with a butter knife. Inside were more letters, these ones in my mother's handwriting. But they weren't to Michael, nor to my father. They were to someone else. The first one stopped my breath. "Dearest Anna, not a day goes by that I don't think of you. I wish I could explain, but I had no choice. They told me it was best for everyone. But I've never stopped wondering if you're safe, if you're happy, if you know you were loved from the start. Anna." My heart pounded. Who was Anna? I read letter after letter, each one more desperate than the last. My mother wrote of a baby, of regret, of being forced to let go. My mind reeled. Could it be? Did she have another child before me? One I never knew about? The next evening I confronted her. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea, her eyes weary but open. "Who is Anna?" I asked, laying the letters down in front of her. Her face crumpled. She pressed her palms to her mouth as if to hold back a sob. For a long time she said nothing. Finally she whispered, "Your sister." The room seemed to tilt. My what? Tears streamed down her face as she explained. Before she married Raymond, before Michael, there had been another story, one she had buried deeper than all the rest. As a young woman barely out of college, she had become pregnant. Her strict parents had forced her into a quiet adoption, insisting it was the only way to preserve the family's reputation. The baby had been taken from her hours after birth. She was never even allowed to hold her. She was my first child. My mother wept. I wanted her. I fought for her. But my parents, they made the decision for me. I thought I could never speak of it. And then I met Michael. Then Raymond. Life swept me forward. But I never forgot her. I sat frozen, trying to absorb it. I had lived my entire life believing my biggest secret was not being my father's daughter. Now I learned I wasn't even my mother's first. There had been another lost to us, hidden away. It explained the letter in the mail. Someone knew. Maybe Anna herself. Maybe someone connected to her. "Where is she?" I demanded. My mother shook her head. "I don't know. I tried to find her once years ago, but the records were sealed. I hit dead ends. But I always hoped—" Her voice broke. "I always hoped one day she'd come to me." The revelation consumed me. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't paint. Every moment was filled with questions. Who was Anna? Was she alive? Healthy? Happy? Did she know about us? Did she hate my mother for abandoning her? Daniel urged me to let it rest to protect myself from more heartbreak. But I couldn't. This wasn't just about secrets anymore. This was about blood, about family. So I hired the investigator again. This time I gave him the letters, the dates, the hospital where my mother had given birth. Weeks passed, each one stretching like an eternity. Finally he called. I found her. Her name was Anna Harper now. She lived just one state over. She was 40, married with 2 children. And he paused here, his voice careful, she knew. She had discovered her adoption papers years ago. She had been looking for answers, too. The letter had been from her. My heart thundered as I dialed the number he gave me. When a woman's voice answered, I nearly dropped the phone. Hello? It was strange, her tone, her cadence. It was familiar, like an echo of myself. Anna. My voice trembled. This is Emily. I think I'm your sister. The silence on the other end stretched long but not empty. It was full of everything neither of us knew how to say. Finally, she whispered, I was hoping you'd call. When we met, it was like staring into a mirror, and a stranger all at once. She had my eyes, my smile, but a life completely different from mine. She had grown up loved by her adoptive family, but always with a sense of something missing. When I found out about the adoption, I thought maybe they didn't want me, she confessed. I thought maybe I was a mistake. No, I told her, tears streaming down my face. You were never a mistake. You were stolen. We talked for hours, piecing together the fractured timeline of our family's hidden history. She wanted to meet our mother. I promised her she could. The day they reunited, I stood by as my mother collapsed into Anna's arms, sobbing words she had held back for decades. I loved you. I always loved you. They took you from me, but I never stopped loving you. Anna held her crying too, and for the first time I saw my mother whole. Not broken by Raymond's cruelty, not diminished by guilt, but restored by a piece of herself she thought was lost forever. The secrets had nearly destroyed us, but in the end they brought us something unexpected, another chance. As for my father, when he learned of Anna, he raged. He called it disgrace, humiliation, another stain on his perfect image. But I didn't flinch this time. His anger no longer held power over me. He had chosen pride over love his whole life. Now he could live in the ruins of it. I had chosen differently. I chose truth no matter how painful. I chose connection no matter how messy. And I chose myself finally, without apology. Because in the end, betrayal had not defined me. Secrets had not broken me. They had only revealed the strength I never knew I had. And as I stood between my mother and my sister, my hand in Daniel's, I realized the real revenge wasn't in exposing my father's lies. It was in building a life that could never again be controlled by them.